Welcome everybody. My name is Henry Hale. I'm a professor of political science and international affairs here at GW Elliott School, and also co-director together with my colleague Marlene Laruelle of Ponar's Eurasia. And we are very happy to have you all here to join us for our session on New Voices on Eurasia, which features some of the brightest stars emerging in the field. And we're delighted to have with us today Volha Charnysh, who is assistant professor of political science at MIT, and also a fellow at the Center for European Politics at Harvard. And she'll be talking to you today about the determinants of assistance to refugees, evidence from Poland. So I think, well, let me just also thank Carnegie Corporation of New York, which supports Ponar's Eurasia and helps us be able to bring in people like Dr. Charnysh to speak with us today, together with the university, of course. So let me just go ahead and turn things over to Volha. She will speak for about half an hour, and then we'll reserve the rest of the time for questions, answers, discussion, what have you. So please join me in welcoming it.
Henry, and I want to say that I'm really excited to be back in Washington. And today I will be talking about an important topic that's been on everyone's mind for over a year now, in particular about the refugee crisis that's unfolding in Europe right now. The motivation for this project is the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February of last year, which uprooted more than 14 million people, and 8 million of these people are currently staying in the EU. And as you all know, Europeans stepped up and welcomed Ukrainian refugees with open arms. Ukrainians have been granted full access to the labor market, to social welfare and services for up to a year, and in some countries for 18 months. And this outpouring of support, some have pointed out, contrasted with European reception of refugees from Syria just a few years back. So in 2015, EU has accepted about 1 million Syrian refugees, and then Turkey to host 3.7 million others. And of course, the rights that Syrian refugees received in Europe were quite different. They had to undergo rather different rules at the very beginning, following arrival, than current Ukrainian refugees do today. And so this raises a few questions that have been highlighted by policymakers and by the media. Most importantly, what explains this disparity in the treatment of Ukrainian and Syrian refugees? But if we're drawing on this contrast, then perhaps we are curious to also understand broader questions of what types of individuals are more likely to help refugees, what types of refugees are more likely to be helped, and finally, how can we encourage helping behavior and decrease backlash against refugees? So today I will be addressing this question by drawing on evidence from Poland. So why Poland? Well, Poland accommodated the largest number of Ukrainian refugees in Europe, about 1.5 million. And Poland implemented some of the most generous policies. So under the law adopted in March 2022, Ukrainians had the right to legally stay in Poland for 18 months. They received exactly the same benefits as Polish citizens, which included immediate access to the labor market, to social welfare, etc. Individuals and businesses helping Ukrainian refugees were receiving subsidies and compensation. Ukrainians were also receiving various allowances. And importantly, support for Ukrainian refugees was nearly anonymous. So in the Polish Sejm, lower chamber of the Polish parliament, most deputies voted in favor of this measure, and Polish citizens were nearly unanimous in helping Ukrainian refugees. And of course, this very open, welcoming response contrasts with the experience Poland had with Syrian refugees a few years back, where together with Hungary and Czech Republic, it broke the EU law by refusing to accept a much smaller number of refugees, just 350 quota within the EU of Syrians. So my collaborators, Leonid Pisakhin, Nick Stup, and Peter van den Wind, have put together a survey that we implemented with 2,500 Polish respondents in September 2022 to understand this difference in receptions toward refugees and to understand how helping behavior can be encouraged. This was a face-to-face survey, so not online survey, and it's representative at the national level in Poland. So we asked a number of questions about past and future help for Syrian and Ukrainian refugees. We also implemented some behavioral measures to understand helping behavior. And most importantly, and this is how we differ from a number of surveys conducted by public opinion companies in Poland and surveys you read about in the media today, is we embedded some vignettes to understand how can we possibly encourage assistance to refugees, and also we embedded some conjoint experiments to understand like what factors exactly explain refugee sentiments and why might we be seeing such different reception of refugees from different countries. And so today I will be presenting mostly results from this survey, although occasionally I will draw on evidence. So we measure different types of helping behavior. And because this is a nationally representative survey, you can also interpret some of the proportions of this behavior as an accurate picture of what's happening in Poland today. So we first asked about past aid to refugees, and we specified what, we then asked respondents to specify what kind of assistance they provided, which included providing food, hygiene products, donating money, volunteering one's time, and actually housing a refugee. We also asked about future aid, whether respondents would help a Syrian or Ukrainian refugee family tomorrow. We asked them about support for government policy toward both Syrian and Ukrainian refugees. Importantly, we asked them whether they would be willing to donate some money to a charity that supports different refugee groups as well as some other causes. So we have a very real behavioral measure of support for different groups of refugees. And we asked them whether they would close a particular package. So today I'll be telling you a little bit of what we found based on these measures. So first of all, let's look at the differences in past and future aid to Syrian and Ukrainian refugees. And here you see results from our survey on the slide. With on one side of the panel, we asked about past assistance, on the other, future assistance. And so first, we see tremendous disparity in the number of individuals who have reported assistance to Syrian refugees versus Ukrainian refugees. More than 5 times as many have helped a Ukrainian refugee, which is basically every second person in our survey. However, interestingly, this disparity is significantly smaller when we ask about future assistance. And so part of this, as I will show you in the rest of our survey, comes from just merely having very few opportunities to assist Syrian refugees because they were, for the most part, not admitted into Poland. And so there's certainly disparity still there, but it's significantly smaller in percentage. Let's see on the right side. Okay, so we inquired about what kind of types of aid, and as you can see here, part of this disparity with past assistance comes from the fact that many Poles have not actually met any Syrian refugees. Most Poles have encountered a Ukrainian refugee and had a chance to assist, but this was not the case with Syria. And so the proportions of assistance among all respondents and respondents who actually indicate meeting at least one refugee in each group are significantly different, although the disparity in help for Syrian and Ukrainian refugees still remains. And as a result of this difference in how many Syrians even made it to Poland, the most prevalent type of assistance to Syrians was donating money, which is different from the Ukrainian refugees. And one other interesting thing that we found was that nearly every respondent who had assisted Syrians, which is a small minority, ended up later assisting Ukrainian refugees, which I will show you on the slide, relates to some of the key determinants of assistance. All right, so hope you can, throughout the slides, you might not see the bottom of the slide. However, I want to tell you that the colors are always the same based on the elements of the national flag for each group. So Syrians are always in red and Ukrainians are always in blue. So even if you can't quite see the label, you can guess which group is what and where. So, you see now a different indicator of helping behavior, which is much more real because people had to contribute money. This is different from promising futures, which would be cheap talk. And so we see again here that the first, on the left, you see how many people actually donated to a charity supporting each refugee group, because there was an option to donate to unrelated charities and not donate anything at all. And on the right side, you see the actual amounts in zloty. And so again, we see the disparity between donating to Syrian and Ukrainian refugees persists, but it is not perhaps as large as you might have imagined when reading the news about opposition to Syrian refugees in Poland. And in particular, 50% of respondents in our sample donated to a charity helping Syrian refugees. And 61% of respondents donated to a charity helping Ukrainian refugees. So the average amount donated varies quite a bit more, but still there's a considerable number of people out there who are supporting Syrian refugees. Okay, so who are these people? And so in the next couple of slides, you will see what type of people help refugees on a number of different characteristics. So we'll start with the basic socioeconomic characteristic. And this is, one thing we essentially find is that people who are better off and who have economic resources to help refugees are more likely to assist, to report past assistance, to report future assistance, which is depicted on the slide, and also to donate. Which is perhaps not surprising, but nevertheless, it's an important pattern. Of course, education also predicts greater willingness to assist refugees. Right-wing vote, on the other hand, is negatively correlated with willingness to assist, and we'll go deeper into this result on the next couple of slides. So you might wonder, okay, here's really important to see the label. So I will move. So next we plot responses to future assistance to refugees by political party. And again, results are very similar when we use other indicators in the system. And so here we start with the Law and Justice, or PIS, and the United Right. And we see that the gap in support, so the gap in support for Syrian and Ukrainian refugees persists throughout, but it's significantly larger for right-wing voters, voters who support the Law and Justice Party, and voters who support the far right, which is Confederation on the opposite side of this plot. And support for assisting different groups of refugees is nearly similar among the center and the left. Right, and here we see a different indicator of this is support for excluding Syrians in Poland. How many people are actually endorsing government policy? In our survey, support is again far from unanimous, and basically peace voters, indeed, in the vast majority, 77% of them support excluding Syrian refugees out. However, voters of all the other parties are split nearly evenly. So for the civic platform bill, we have 49%, 50% of the voters that support this policy. Okay, so I just want to say here that our findings are generally consistent with findings by CEPOS in 2017. So this is the time when there was only one refugee crisis in Europe. It was Syrians. And we see again that the far right and voters of the law and justice were opposing the arrival of Syrian refugees, and that were opposing Poland accepting these refugees. However, again, voters of the other parties were divided nearly 50-50. So I'll speak the bottom of the graph, which talks about Ukrainians, but the patterns are very much the same. Okay, so I have just shown you the differences in willingness to assist refugees by socioeconomic status and by partisanship. However, in our survey, we found that conditional on political views, conditional on demographic factors, and many other like obvious explanations, it's actually how empathetic individuals really are that predicts their support for refugees. And we were surprised by this because we assumed that some of these empathy variables will wash out when we look at education levels and gender and so on. So we use interpersonal reactivity index to measure personal empathy. And this involves agreement with 7 different statements. And you see some of them on the slide. For example, I often work with people less fortunate than me. So some people really are much more empathetic internally. And these people tend to disproportionately help refugees. And the results, interestingly enough, are nearly identical to Syrian and Ukrainian refugees. So again, you see blue and red on the slide. So blue is Ukrainians. And in fact, empathy matters a little bit more for Syrian refugees. And again, just note the size of this index. So here we plot standardized coefficients, and you see that empathy is much more powerful as a predictor of help than economic variables, than education level, and the religiosity and party label, which is not. Okay. And here you see how donations vary with empathy. So the more empathetic an individual is, the more he or she is likely to donate to a charity supporting Syrian or Ukrainian refugees. So this is a measure of actual behavior of support. Okay, so we have to consider, some of the common explanations for the disparity, of course, is cultural similarity. Poles and Ukrainians are viewed as much more similar. Syrians are viewed as culturally distant, unable to assimilate, and they also are Muslim. And so we did find some evidence that cultural similarity, individuals who view Syrians and Ukrainians as more culturally similar are more likely to offer assistance. However, the effect size is relatively small compared to other variables in our survey and not really comparable to variables like empathy. Okay, so now I will move on to the second part of the analysis, which was what type of refugees are more likely to be helped. So, we've seen the disparity between Syrian and Ukrainians, but what is exactly explaining this? People have a certain view of Syria that is quite different than Ukraine. Poland is situated, Poland is bordering Ukraine, and Ukraine was attacked by Russia. So there are many things that might proxy and correspond to the country of origin. And so it's important to really understand what dimensions exactly drive assistance and hide beyond this very broad and general country label. So we did this using conjugate experiments, and I'll explain to you a little bit what that means. But basically, each respondent observed 2 different profiles of refugees, and each profile contained 5 different attributes. So we selected attributes based on existing explanations for the disparity in support of Syrian and Ukrainian refugees. Namely, this were family type, skin color to proxy kind of racial concerns, religion to proxy this difference in support for Muslims and Christians, degree of suffering, I'll show you how we operationalize that, and socioeconomic status. And then within each condition, the order of this attribute is randomized, and each respondent chooses between 2 different profiles and then answers a bunch of questions for this profile. And because of the randomization, we're able to kind of estimate what exactly is driving. And so here you see an example. So respondents are told that they will see a few profiles of refugees, and then they get a choice between two different refugees. Importantly, we do not compare Syrians and Ukrainians here implicitly on the slide. The respondents are not choosing between a Syrian and Ukrainian refugee. They are looking at two Ukrainians with different characteristics, and so sometimes it's a single young man, other times it's a mother with a child. Age we keep the same. We vary physical appearance. There are some Ukrainians who are white. There are some Ukrainians who are, have dark skin, black hair, black eyes. We look at religion, Christian and Muslim. Again, I will remind you there's a Muslim population in Ukraine. So we also vary kind of refugee suffering by including information whether the refugee had relatives killed by Russia. And so we do the same for Syrians, and within each of this profile, the characteristics vary. So they don't see a coherent profile. Each characteristic is independently randomized. So essentially it allows us to consider each characteristic independently of the other, and in aggregate understand what type of characteristics are more likely to increase hosting behavior. And abstract with this view of Syrians are always Muslim, always darker skin, etc. Okay, so here you see responses aggregated for different conditions and the different types of refugees, Syrians, and Ukrainians. And here you see the plot that presents average marginal component effects, but basically, how a particular characteristic increases hosting behavior relative to the baseline characteristics. And so I'll show you what those baseline characteristics are on the slide. So hopefully you can hear me. Here we compare the willingness to host a single young mother with child relative to the single young man, which is the baseline. We look at the effect of skin relative to white. We look at the effect of Muslim characteristic relative to Christian. We also look at whether hosting a refugee relative to refugees relatives were killed affects behavior, and we also looked at the economic characteristics. So a poor refugee consumer versus a well-off refugee program. And so how far this effect size is from zero explains kind of the size of the effect. The more bigger, the more important this effect is. And so you see what comes off as the biggest effect in our survey is hosting a young mother with a child. So regardless of whether refugee is Syrian or Ukrainian, this is by far the biggest determinant of willingness to host in magnitude. We of course also see anti-Muslim bias, which has been observed by other studies, and it's indeed happening, and it's happening even for Ukrainians. If you're encountering a, say, white mother with a child who happens to be Muslim and comes from Ukraine, she's less likely to be hosted in our survey. We also see a small effect of suffering in the expected direction, and also we see that the programmer is less likely to be hosted than a poor and cleaner. So I'll draw attention to this result because it goes against the literature on voluntary immigration, where people generally prefer migrants with higher skill sets because they are perceived to be better for the economy. And this result suggests more concern about communitarian needs. So someone like poor might need more help than someone who is well off. The same goes for mother with a child, who for voluntary migration could be argued to require more social support. But when we think about humanitarian need, mother with a child certainly deserves more help. That perspective than a single young. Okay, so here is the same graph, but we are disaggregating results for Syrian and Ukrainian refugees. Again, remember, respondents are not comparing one to the other. However, here, by looking at this graph, we can just see whether the general relevance of each characteristic independently has the same impact on hosting behavior for Ukrainian refugees and for Syrian refugees. And again, it looks like regardless of where refugees come from, whether Ukrainian or Syrian, the same characteristics have about the same effect size. So for Syrians and Ukrainians alike, a single young mother with child is more likely to be hosted. Muslims are less likely to be hosted. Individuals who did not have a relative killed are less likely to be hosted. This is the negative side of the slide. Well-off individuals are less likely to be hosted than poor individuals. And there is an effect of dark skin, light hair. Okay, so we asked a few follow-up questions to kind of get at this effect, which involved individuals agreeing with statements about each kind of refugee. And I'll show you just two graphs, but essentially we see that respondents are much more likely to view a refugee to be in great need when the refugee is a single young mother with child, which makes sense. Less likely when the refugee is a programmer. We also again see a slight Muslim effect, but again look at the effect size. So while the effect is negative, statistically significant, it's removed from zero, so it's definitely there. It's in magnitude much smaller than the relevance of being a single young mother with child or perceived need that the refugee has. Okay, on the other hand, when we talk about the risk of crime and terrorism, one concern with some refugees in Europe, we see that single young mother with child condition means individuals are less likely by far to agree with this statement. However, when the refugee is Muslim, again, regardless of where the refugee comes from, they are much more likely to agree. Which again reflects this common stereotypes in these Muslims that have been sort of Europe and explain a big part of the differential. Okay, so what have we found so far? So to underscore, the key predictor of assistance, the biggest difference that appears to increase hosting behavior is really this interpersonal difference in empathy. So more empathetic, inherently more empathetic individuals are more likely to assist both Syrian and Ukrainian refugees. They're more likely to donate to refugee-oriented charities. Humanitarian need, consistent with this empathy result, within refugees is the most important factor in explaining variation in the system. It's much more influential than other characteristics, such as cultural consideration, which also matter, but they matter less than humanitarian need on balance. Finally, individuals who are more well-off and have more resources to help more. And when we think about respondents' ideological preferences, as expected, right-wing voters are more likely to demonstrate the largest gap in support for Syrian versus Ukrainian refugees. Okay, so the important policy question here is how can we encourage helping behavior? And so our survey so far suggests a few ideas that we had prior to running the survey and pre-registered. And one idea that comes is that if empathy predicts helping behavior, then maybe we want to know where empathy comes from, where this inherent differences in empathy come from, and also whether we can increase empathy for refugees to improve host behavior and decrease backlash. And so in our survey, we found that individuals who report their families being displaced during World War II or suffered violence during World War II. So on the slide here, you see violent experience, but the goals and results are similar. Score significantly higher on the inherent levels of empathy. And furthermore, self-reported victimization during World War II, experiencing displacement or having relatives killed, predicts helping behavior in our survey. And again, predicts it for both Syrians and Ukrainians. So I just want to remind you that Poland during World War II suffered huge losses and also experienced significant displacement, both as a result of wartime violence, but also the result of border changes and forced population transfer that resulted from the shift in Polish territory. So the natural question then is whether reminding respondents of shared experience of victimization can increase aid for refugees. So to study this question, we used an experimental prime, which was randomized, which allows us to kind of understand whether receiving more information about the suffering of one group and the parallels in its experience with Poles experienced during World War II might increase hosting behavior, or perhaps also change this gap in helping behavior in Syrians and Ukrainians. So on the slide you see we use some images, and here you see Syrian civilians in Aleppo. We also used images from Warsaw Uprising in 1944, which in Poland is a significant symbol of victimization during World War II. And we used text that highlighted similarities in experience between Poles and Syrians. So I'll give you a moment to look at the slide. All right, we did the same for Ukrainians. So you see just one image, but we've done Syrians and Ukrainians separately and randomized it to conditions. And we also considered whether simply seeing an image of suffering civilians, Ukrainian or Syrians, without the reminder of shared experience affects empathy and hosting behavior and supporting behavior toward refugees. Now, sadly, we found null results. And so, can't see what the conditions are on the slide. However, so you see two treatments. So, and again, the colors remind you about each group of refugees relative to control. But essentially, we found that neither reminding of refugees suffering by itself, nor reminding of the suffering and highlighting the suffering similarities to what Poles experienced during World War II had increased in a statistically significant way, helping behavior toward refugees. And here you see just future willingness, but results are identical for donation. So this simple highlighting, it's not as so simple to actually prime people to support refugees by highlighting shared experience. And the process is much more complicated. Okay, I am almost done. So long-term outlook. You know, I want to finish with kind of looking into the future, and I'll start with somewhat worrying news from Poland. Is even though Poles have demonstrated this strong support for Ukrainian refugees at the beginning of the war, and they're still very much supportive and concerned about the situation, support for Ukrainians is gradually decreasing. And so sample survey data suggests a 10% decrease just from December to January 2023. As a result of this kind of changing sentiment, people are growing tired. They don't know how long the crisis will persist. And as a result of this change in sentiment, politicians are responding with kind of adjusting the benefits of Ukrainian refugees. So the December 2022 law had stated that Ukrainian refugees would have to cover some of the costs of their stay starting March 2023. So that will be a year since the conflict started. And this law was again almost universally supported, but support on parties has waned, and even some deputies from PO abstained from supporting this law. And most concerningly, the Law and Justice Party is facing a right-wing challenger. So we all have kind of read about how he's quite right-wing, but the challenge is coming actually from the far right, Confederation here, which is kind of this motley group of politicians who are staunchly opposed to hosting Ukrainian refugees and all refugees in general. Here you see Robert Kanditsky on the slide. So far, the Polish society has not embraced this challenge very much, and the Polish journalists, for example, boycotted the conference on the topic of hosting Ukrainian refugees. Nevertheless, it's a sign of concern. Okay, so there's some long-term strategies that are important to think about for Poland and for the EU more broadly about how to kind of transition from this short-term support at the time of the crisis for more kind of long-term measures that can mitigate the possible strain and burden that host societies like Poland feel, and can also facilitate refugee integration in the longer term. I'll just give you some thoughts on this slide, but I look forward to
Okay, well, thank you very much for a very interesting conversation and presentation. So we'll go ahead and have questions, discussion now. Maybe I'll just take the prerogative of the chair to ask a couple initial questions to get the discussion going. So it's fascinating findings. And I guess just, two that stuck out to me as you were talking were, first of all, the discrepancy between the willingness in particular of the Law and Justice Party and kind of the far right groups to support Ukrainians versus Syrians. And also, of course, the findings on empathy, which I thought were interesting. So one question I had was, how do these two connect? Did the Law and Justice supporters, do they turn out to be like less empathetic, kind of on this abstract scale? Or kind of how does that connect? And I guess the other general question I'd be interested in is, obviously Poland's the biggest recipient of Ukrainian refugees now. But would you expect the same kind of patterns that you found here? I know this is going out on a limb, but maybe you've done research on this. I don't know, but I'd be interested just in your thoughts. Would you expect the same kinds of findings, say in Germany or other countries that might be taking in Ukrainians or Syrians? So I just wonder how you might think about whether or not these same kinds of patterns might be found elsewhere.
I will preface this. These are great points, and I'll just preface this by saying that we have not checked the empathy of peace voters in our survey. We absolutely will after receiving this suggestion, but I don't know how well that finding would go if we found them to be less empathetic. However, I do see this general difference between this people who tend to support right-wing parties have been observed in other studies to have like the more authoritarian personality types, which often goes with less empathy and understanding toward fellow human beings. I think with regard to the law and justice, part of the issue is that a big part of the agenda for this party is Russian threat. And so I imagine that the voters for this party are motivated to help Ukrainian refugees for a number of reasons. Some of these reasons certainly have to deal with concern for the refugees and empathy. A lot of these refugees are also happen to be religious. And so certainly some support is probably based on that, but also they're concerned about Russia. And in this case, they are also responding to this kind of conflict that happened on Poland's eastern periphery. And they are very supportive of also kind of more defensive and military response, so military aid to Ukraine. And so as a result, supporting refugees comes as this like element of helping Ukraine fight the fight on the east, as opposed to simply feeling bad for refugees and endorsing their right to seek shelter and help. And I will just say this is just kind of my hunch. We very much need to test this. Okay, so I do expect to see the same pattern in other countries. So this empathy finding was something actually that surprised us. We wanted to measure it because we expected that our experimental manipulations, just kind of reminding of the suffering of refugees, will increase empathy. But we also wanted to have a baseline of empathy for each individual. So that's why we use this kind of inherent empathy scale. Maybe it shouldn't have surprised us in light of how refugees are different from voluntary migrants. So refugees are, are in need of asylum. They suffer from the consequences of war. And so the justification for opening doors of refugees and helping them has been historically, and the whole international refugee regime is based on the humanitarian need of this refugee. And so we shouldn't have been surprised by this finding. And for this reason, I expect the empathy finding to hold all around Europe. And I also expect right-wing parties around Europe to have very different views on refugees, no matter where they come from. For example, you highlighted Germany, and so the AfD, again, we haven't tested this, but I imagine they are much less willing to support Ukrainian refugees, just as they were much less willing to support Syrian refugees, which was not the case for other.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I think we can open it up to questions, comments from the floor. Yes, please. Yeah, over here. You can please wait for the microphone so the online audience can hear. Just please introduce yourself.
Thank you. Yeah, my name is José Rivera. I'm a graduate student here at Elliott, and I was wondering about your process and the surveys that you mentioned. Were there pictures included on the survey? Was it just a description that was written? And do you believe that the inclusion or lack of had an effect?
Thank you. So the survey, most of the survey did not have images. So it was a face-to-face survey, and we used the survey company, and so survey enumerators used tablets, but individuals were responding to the questions they read off the tablets. However, for the experimental manipulation that reminded individuals of the suffering the refugee experienced, and also of Polish experience in World War II. So you've seen that one slide, right? Respondents were, survey enumerators were told to show the tablet, to have respondents read and see the images. And we spent a lot of time selecting this, carefully selecting the specific images to highlight, on the one hand, the suffering of each refugee group, on the other hand, the parallels in Polish suffering. So, you saw just one image, but essentially, we divided respondents into 5 groups, and one group received just control condition, which was nothing. And then another group received a photo of Syrian refugees with a story about the suffering that they're experiencing. Another group received a very similar photo of Ukrainian refugees, which was essentially a group of people passing ruins and carrying children, which was again selected to be very similar. So that was the third condition. And then the other 2 conditions were the same images of suffering civilians, either Syrian or Ukrainian, with an additional photo of Warsaw Uprising displaced civilians, which you also saw in the slide, black and white, and this line about the parallels of experience between Poles suffering in World War II and either Syrians or Ukrainians. So there were actually 5 total experimental groups in our survey that we tried. So those are the only images. And we essentially found that, I reported on this parallels and shared experience, and I showed you null result also for the suffering. So even empathy, what we find is that this inherent empathy that people have predicts support for refugees, and also their self-reported suffering in World War II correlates with both empathy on that scale and also support for refugees. However, trying to prime empathy by telling them Syrians are suffering or Ukrainians are suffering, or also saying, well, they're suffering and we suffered like that, does not, with images, which should be graphic and more effective, which is why we included them, does not seem to make a difference, which was, frustrating for us, but the survey sample is pretty large, so it's just not as simple as it appears to increase support for refugees in this way.
I guess just one related kind of follow-up question would just be, how do the Polish media treat the issue anyway? How do they frame the refugee issue? Are they already talking constantly about World War II, in which case then maybe the audience is already kind of pre-primed to have this comparison in mind, like the Polish experience, or are the refugees, at least from Ukraine, framed in different ways?
Yeah, excellent question. So, we've read a lot about how this issue is reported. And so, first of all, you certainly get very different reports about Syrians and Ukrainians, which you kind of probably anticipate based on media elsewhere. And so with Ukrainian refugees, there's more media stories right now. And the media stories are quite different than, just last year, there was also an incident on the Belarusian border. So it was not the same as the Syrian refugees crisis from 2015, which is what we mostly asked respondents, but it was also kind of an example of refugees at the border. And so reporting of that story was very different, kind of emphasizing security threats and generally, avoiding this human kind of angle story. Although there were some media, particularly on the left, who also emphasized the suffering of Syrians and the refugees from the Middle East on the Belarusian Polish border. So that's one point. On the second point, you were asking about World War II and how that the whole thing relates to this. And so I will say it's not overemphasized in the Polish media. So we were considering different elements of Polish-Ukrainian experience, and World War II has like many memories. Some are quite actually traumatic for Poles, but the media generally does not bring this up. There were a few articles that highlighted Warsaw Uprising, which is why we selected that image and that frame over Polish displacement after World War II. But even that story was relatively minor. It probably appeared around the time when there was this anniversary of Warsaw Uprising. And so some Polish academics made this kind of parallel between Polish and Ukrainian experience, which also is why we again focus on the Warsaw Uprising, because that appears to encapsulate the most Polish most similar Polish experience, but it's absolutely not something that's regularly talked about. In fact, a lot of the time the media talks about let's put our past behind, because Polish-Ukrainian peace in World War II is extremely complicated. There was domestic cleansing, or for instance, it was genocide perpetrated by Ukrainians against Poles, and so the media actually tries to put that behind, and there's relatively little mention of World War II at all in stories about Ukrainian refugees.
Great, we have a question here. And the next one in the back.
Hi, John Trobak, Illiberalism Studies Program. In a sense, Henry, you preempted my question, but I'll ask it anyway because I'm interested in the specifics. I was curious about the inverse of that primer. Specifically, if far-right organizations and far-right parties amplifying messages, negative messages about the Muslim identity, about threat of terrorism, would, if your intuition is that if this would have an effect in terms of shifting empathy in individuals. Thank you.
Yeah, so the far right. So I will just say that it was absolutely the case that when the Syrian refugee crisis was particularly acute, the biggest kind of stories in the media, and not just the right-wing media, but particularly the right-wing media, were about this security risk and about Syrian refugees being predominantly male and actually coming for different reasons than trying to find refuge. Today, the far-right parties that are anti-refugee, and in this case, Ukrainian refugees, the confederation that I mentioned, they actually highlight that Ukrainians are just like coming for benefits and that they should work as opposed to getting handouts. So that message is not a security message, at least from what I've seen, but more just like this is a party that combines some libertarian directions with anti-refugee policy, and so the message is more along the lines of like Poles should lower taxes and not support this additional refugee group, and Ukrainians should work. However, certainly how refugees are being covered in the media has an important effect, and particularly with respect to Syrian refugees, because in fact most Poles have not met Syrian refugees, as you've seen from the analysis. So what they're reading is kind of what they imagine these refugees to be. And that certainly, I've also shown you a slide when we vary different refugee characteristics, and we ask about the concerns about crime and terrorism, the two frames that are often used in right-wing media for trying to securitize refugees. And so you'd expect that maybe mother with children would have a negative effect on that, but you wouldn't necessarily expect all else equal that Muslim would. But that's in fact what we see, and I imagine a big part of it is, the security situation in Europe with kind of the right-wing media framing Syrian refugees.
Great, thank you. Yes.
Hi, my name is Evelyn Baldwin. I'm a freshman at the Elliott School. I was wondering if you think that age might play a role in willingness to help. You talked a little bit about social media, so maybe the younger generation being more receptive to the dissemination of information, or you also talked about World War II, so maybe the older generation. So kind of how do you think that age plays a role?
So we used age as a covariant. I don't remember that we found a significant result, but I think it will play into different ways, right? So I think that on the one hand, the young voters, or the young individuals, are probably reading very different types of media and seeing the war in quite different terms. So absolutely, they might be less impacted by parallels to World War II. They might not remember, so we asked this question about people's families in World War II. They might not remember things about their family, or those things might not be as salient. I would say that, because we are finding such a strong positive impact of having material resources, having your own apartment, having more rooms, and higher income, this generally correlates positively with age. And so that might suggest that actually the age by itself does not really have an offsetting kind of effect aside from the material well-being. And I just want to say, like, I forgot to mention this with respect to the other question, but it also relates to age. Is just this inherent personality trait, empathy, that we measure. The way it's measured is such that it should be different from, like, seeing a story about refugees in the media, because it's not asking about a specific refugee group. And so this is a scale developed by psychologists to kind of assess, just like very independently, differences across individuals, no matter what their age is and no matter what kind of people they are imagining when they're answering these questions. And so this is something that should be independent from the media reports. It's different about, do you feel sorry for refugees? And should be also independent from the age, because it asks about just very kind of common lives.
Great. So we have a couple questions over here. First in the back, and then.
Hi, I'm Michelle Yurkovich. I'm an assistant professor at UMass Boston and just passing through, but thought this was really fascinating. So when you were talking about empathy, I was thinking about Paul Bloom's work. So he is a psychologist at Yale, most notable for his book Against Empathy, but has a strain of research which says we have to be very careful how we think about the role of empathy and encouraging it to help people, because oftentimes empathy actually serves to deepen prejudices, because if you ask what makes a person feel empathy towards one entity over another, what you're really asking about is not empathy. There's actually often a lot of undercurrents of racism and discrimination in how we think about that. So I wondered how you thought about and kind of position your work on empathy and its role kind of in relation to that broader critique that's coming out recently. And then I wondered if we could expand out of Poland, and we wanted to ask, what explains variation in how we treat different refugees? Because I wonder if what would be captured in a survey within the country may learn something from kind of a broader trend. So for example, the food ration that a Ukrainian receives is substantially better than the food ration that an Afghan or a Yemeni refugee receives today from the same organization. Now, that includes the ration that's given to women and children. So as your survey showed, people may have a greater feeling of empathy towards women and children, but we know in other ways in which refugee policy works, that isn't enough of an explainer, right? Even within that category, you're going to treat certain women and children differently. So I guess what would happen if we expanded out a bit more generally?
Okay, this is a tough questions. I mean, I will say, so I know what you're talking about with respect to empathy, oftentimes contributing to racism and discrimination. For example, although I'll bring up different studies that the ones you mentioned, for example, there's such a finding as kind of greater support for foreign aid toward Black Africans over white East Europeans in one of the studies by Baker. Which is explained by prejudice, but a kind of prejudice that suggests that Black Africans need help. So this is not quite what you're talking about, but this is an example where what we might understand as empathy can actually work in quite different ways, even as it increases aid. I think in our survey, we did not find either this inherent personality trait or our prime of empathy to backfire. We were worried about this, and that's why we kind of separated Syrians and Ukrainians and separated the photos that emphasize suffering from the more complicated treatment that emphasized also the perils and experience, because we were worried in particular when we talked about Syrians, whether some Poles might be upset about this parallel in their experience to what Syrians are experiencing. At least empirically, we did not really find this result. So this is kind of all I could master given the situation, but thank you for the question.
Great, thank you, yes.
Hello, my name is Antonina Borusivenko. I'm a visiting scholar here at Elliott. And my question is, what is the proportion between the working, non-working, and volunteering Ukrainians refugees in Poland? If you don't know those figures. Thank you.
So you mean Ukrainian refugees and how many of them are working? Right. So I don't know the specific numbers for Poland, but the recent statistic from other countries, which might track pretty well for Poland, is that about 40% of Ukrainian refugees in Europe are currently employed. And this is actually a pretty high proportion relative to other countries. And so actually one of the things I was thinking about in terms of policy responses, which is not as simple as kind of increasing emphasis and highlighting this on women and children, is simply just allowing a larger number of Ukrainians to work, in particular to use the high skills that they do have, because these women and children that are arriving in countries like Poland that disproportionately have higher education levels, and they have worked at the time when the war broke out. And so today, not all of them are able to work, but the reason is sometimes lack of childcare, because there's mothers with children, sometimes with elderly dependents, and also the lack of recognition of their qualifications. So the ones that do work among this 40%, so again, don't know the statistics from the top of my head for Poland, a lot of them work in low-skilled temporary jobs, but they actually have qualifications in places like, in the health sector, for example, which is kind of what Europe has a shortage and particularly tight labor market.
Okay, thank you. I think we're pretty much out of time unless there's any final quick questions. You have yeah, okay, we can squeeze in one last one. Yeah.
Hi, so I'm Mark Giudice. I'm from the University of New Hampshire, studying political science and international affairs. One thing that refugees tend to face is that the more borders that they cross, the less legitimate their claim of being a refugee is. Since Poland obviously borders Ukraine, that claim isn't very tenable. In other European countries, do you see that Ukrainians' claim to being a refugee diminishes the legitimacy in the eyes of the public in those countries decreases, or does it sort of stay the same, or is there no effect? Thank you.
So this is also something we didn't study, but I have looked at other surveys on this. And so I was particularly fascinated to find out, as this was Ipsos survey, that across the world, I think they did a survey in 28 countries, which included countries all around the world, including Malaysia, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, a bunch of European countries, and so on. In all but 2 countries, which included, I think, United Arab Emirates, more than half of respondents were positively predisposed towards supporting Ukrainian refugees. This was particularly striking for me because that suggests that it's not as simple as, so you brought up just simply countries further along. So that would be about, for example, countries like Germany, which is the next one over from Poland and also hosting quite a few Ukrainian refugees. They are receiving an outpouring of support. They have, they have various useful things and policies that they are benefiting from in Germany, but also, particularly for me, was striking that it applied to countries that are, oftentimes predominantly Muslim or non-Christian. And so I think there's something about this war, something about this being women and children, reports of Russian aggression in Ukraine that galvanized support all around the world. And so strikingly, even in countries far and wide, Ukrainian refugees are often receiving more support than refugees from other places. So it's a very complicated question, but I was quite surprised to find that. This is Ipsos survey.
Okay, well, unfortunately, we're out of time. It's been a fascinating discussion. So please join me in thanking Dr. Charnysh.
Thank you so much, great questions.
Great, thanks a lot. Yeah, that's right.